On a cold December morning in 2023, in the peaceful town of Broomfield, Colorado, police discovered the body of Crystal Krug, a talented biochemical engineer and mother of three, lying in a pool of blood in her home garage. The wounds to her head and chest revealed this was a brutal, premeditated attack. But what led to this tragedy? For months before her death, Crystal had been living in constant fear due to threatening messages from a man calling himself Anthony Holland, an ex-boyfriend from over 20 years ago. These messages weren't just obscene and threatening, but contained terrifying details about her daily life, as if this stalker was constantly watching her every move. Crystal had done everything right. She reported to police, meticulously documented every message in a stalker log, took firearm safety classes, and installed security camera systems. Her husband, Dan Krug, seemed like the perfect supportive spouse, standing by his wife throughout this terrifying ordeal, even helping her update the stalker documentation. But when police tracked down Anthony Holland, they discovered a shocking truth. He had a perfect alibi, hundreds of miles away from Colorado at the time of the crime. So who had been sending the threatening messages? Who knew such intimate details about Crystal's life? And most importantly, who had taken the life of an innocent mother? As detectives dug deeper into the digital evidence, they uncovered a complex web of deception and a heartbreaking betrayal from the person Crystal trusted most. This story will prove that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. Because no matter how well criminals may hide in the shadows, no matter how sophisticated their schemes, the truth will always find a way to surface, and justice will be served. The days of October 2023 in the town of Broomfield, Colorado, unfolded like any other ordinary day. The crystal-clear skies of the American West stretched endlessly, and life in the Anthem Highlands neighborhood flowed to the familiar rhythm of a peaceful middle-class community. Crystal Krug, a 43-year-old woman with lustrous brown hair and intelligent eyes, began each day with a warm smile for her three children. Crystal was not only a devoted mother, but also an exceptional biochemical engineer, with prestigious credentials and an admirably successful career. She took pride in her ability to balance demanding laboratory work with her role as a mother. Each morning, she rose early to prepare breakfast for the entire family, check the children's homework, and give her husband Dan a goodbye kiss before he drove to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, where he worked as a financial analyst. Dan Krug, Crystal's husband, was an ordinary-looking man with a neat appearance and mature demeanor. His colleagues regarded him as a reliable employee, quiet but efficient. In the eyes of neighbors and friends, they were a typical happy family with three healthy children and a bright future ahead. But this tranquility was about to be shattered by something very unusual. On a late September day in 2023, while Crystal was preparing dinner for the family, her phone buzzed with a new message notification. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the phone, expecting a message from a colleague or perhaps from the children's school. Instead, what she saw made her look twice. The message came from an unknown phone number with content that made her feel uneasy. "Hi, hope it's okay. I looked you up. I go to Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game?" The sender identified himself with the name Anthony Holland, a name that Crystal had to think about for a moment before remembering. Anthony Holland, the young man she had briefly dated over 20 years ago during college. Memories of Anthony weren't very clear in Crystal's mind. They had only known each other for a short period during the summer before her senior year of college. That relationship had ended naturally when life took them in different directions. Since then, she had never had any contact with him. Anthony's sudden contact after more than 2 decades made her feel confused and worried. Crystal decided not to reply to the message, hoping that Anthony would understand and not continue contacting her. She told Dan about the message while they were cleaning up the kitchen after dinner. Dan listened with a concerned expression and advised his wife to block that phone number if there were any more messages. But the story didn't end there. In the following days, Crystal received more messages from Anthony. Initially, these messages remained within the bounds of politeness, but gradually they became inappropriate and disturbing. Anthony sent unsuitable images and wrote messages describing Crystal's body in detail, in ways that made her feel violated and disgusted. What was more concerning was that Anthony seemed to know many details about Crystal's current life. He knew where she worked, knew her schedule for taking the children to school, and even knew small details like when she went to the dentist. In one message, Anthony wrote, "Saw you at dentist, see you soon," making Crystal feel like she was being watched everywhere, all the time. The situation worsened when Anthony began posting Crystal's phone number on dating websites with inappropriate descriptions. Her phone constantly buzzed with calls and messages from strange men, forcing her to change her phone number. But somehow, Anthony still found her new number and continued the harassment campaign. Crystal, with her organized nature and logical thinking as an engineer, decided not to let this situation continue without action. She began creating a detailed Excel document, calling it her stalker log, recording every message, email, and call from Anthony. Each entry included the exact time, message content, and screenshots as evidence. Crystal understood that if she wanted police intervention, she needed complete and accurate documentation. Dan showed concern and anger about this situation. He encouraged his wife to report to police immediately and suggested installing additional security cameras around the house. Dan also volunteered to help Crystal update the stalker log and regularly checked his wife's phone to see if there were any new threatening messages. His care and support made Crystal feel fortunate to have a husband who always stood by her side during this difficult time. However, there were times when Crystal felt that Dan seemed to know too much about the technical details of stalking. He made specific predictions about how Anthony might be tracking them, and sometimes he knew about message contents that Crystal hadn't had time to read. But in her state of stress and worry, she thought this was just due to Dan's excessive concern for the family's safety. The situation escalated seriously when Anthony began sending direct threatening messages to Dan. He sent a photo of Dan entering his workplace with the caption, "This your husband?" This sent the entire Krug family into a state of panic. If Anthony was really following them and had photos of Dan, then the threat had become very specific and dangerous. Crystal decided to visit her father, Lars Grimsrud, to tell him about the situation and ask for advice. Lars was an experienced man who worked on vintage cars in his garage and was always the person Crystal turned to when she needed counsel. When he heard his daughter tell him about being stalked, Lars felt extremely worried and angry. He advised Crystal to carry a gun for self-defense and gave her a firearm from his collection. Crystal, although not wanting to resort to this level, agreed and began taking firearm safety classes. She learned how to use the weapon accurately and safely, hoping she would never have to use it. However, carrying a gun made her feel somewhat more secure when leaving the house. With the stalker log growing thicker and evidence accumulating, Crystal finally decided to go to the Broomfield Police Department to make an official report about the situation. On November 7, 2023, she brought all her documents and screenshots to meet with Detective Andrew Martinez. Crystal sat in Detective Martinez's office, a small room with fluorescent lighting and the smell of old coffee. She presented the situation systematically and in detail, showing the professional character and logical thinking of an engineer. Detective Martinez listened attentively, took careful notes, and occasionally asked for additional details about times and locations. However, Detective Martinez showed hesitation about taking immediate action. He explained that although there was substantial evidence of harassment, to be able to arrest Anthony Holland, police needed digital evidence proving definitively that he was the person behind the threatening messages and emails. This required court-issued search warrants and cooperation from telecommunications companies, a process that could take weeks or even months. Crystal left the police station with mixed feelings of hope and disappointment. She hoped that finally someone would help her resolve this situation, but was also disappointed that there couldn't be immediate action to stop Anthony. On the way home, Crystal decided to hire a private investigator to search for Anthony Holland's current address. She thought that if they could pinpoint his exact location, police would be able to act more quickly. The private investigator, after a few days of investigation, reported that Anthony Holland was currently living in Utah, hundreds of miles from Colorado. This news made Crystal feel more confused. If Anthony was in Utah, how could he know her daily schedule in such detail? How could he take photos of Dan at his workplace? Had he hired someone in Colorado to monitor their family? These questions caused Crystal to lose sleep and worry constantly. She began changing her daily routine, taking different routes when driving the children to school, and always checking around before entering the house. She also asked Dan to install additional security cameras and motion sensor lights around the house. Dan appeared very supportive and understanding of this situation. He regularly checked in with his wife throughout the workday to ensure she was safe. He also researched various security measures and suggested improvements to protect the family. However, there were times when Dan seemed to know too many details about the threatening messages, even before Crystal had time to read them. When Crystal mentioned possibly changing her phone number again, Dan advised against it. He reasoned that changing the phone number might cause them to lose track of Anthony and make the investigation more difficult. This advice seemed reasonable, but it also meant that Crystal had to continue enduring threatening messages every day. The situation within the family began to strain under the pressure of this psychological terrorism. Crystal became suspicious and vigilant of every strange sound, every unfamiliar car parked near the house, and every stranger in the neighborhood. Her children also began to sense their mother's anxiety, and occasionally asked why she always checked her phone and looked out the windows. Dan and Crystal began sleeping in separate rooms, which Dan explained was so he could stay up late to keep watch and ensure the family's safety. However, this physical distance also reflected the emotional distance gradually forming between them. Crystal felt increasingly lonely and helpless in the fight against the invisible stalker. She only trusted her father and brother, who were always ready to listen and support her during this difficult time. Meanwhile, Detective Martinez was still waiting for results from the digital search warrants, a lengthy, bureaucratic process that no one could predict when it would be completed. And so, Crystal Krug's life had completely changed, from the peaceful existence of a successful mother and engineer to a life filled with fear and vigilance. She didn't know that the real danger wasn't coming from a distant stalker in Utah, but was very close, right within her own home. The days of November 2023 passed with a suffocating atmosphere at the Broomfield Police Department. Detective Andrew Martinez, a veteran officer with more than 15 years of experience in the field, sat at his desk piled high with case files and stared at his computer screen with weary eyes. Before him lay the stalking case of Crystal Krug, a case that seemed simple but had become mysteriously complex. Martinez had sent search warrant requests to the courts for tracking digital information related to Anthony Holland. These requests included access to email accounts, records from mobile phone service providers, and IP address information from the threatening messages. However, this process was proceeding at a disappointingly slow pace. Major telecommunications companies like Google, Verizon, and AT&T received thousands of similar requests each month from law enforcement agencies across the country. They had complex internal procedures for reviewing and responding to these requests, prioritizing cases with high urgency, such as terrorism or crimes that had already occurred. A stalking case, though concerning, was usually not placed on the top priority list. While waiting for results from the digital requests, Martinez decided to strengthen traditional investigative measures. He contacted police departments in Utah and Idaho, where the private investigator had identified that Anthony Holland might be living. Phone calls were made to verify Holland's address and current status. At the same time, Martinez also directed increased patrols in the area around the Krug family home. Police cars were requested to frequently drive through the Anthem Highlands neighborhood, especially during times when Crystal usually traveled, such as when taking children to school or returning from work. The goal was to look for any signs of surveillance or suspicious behavior from strangers in the area. However, these efforts did not yield significant results. No one in the neighborhood noticed strange men or unfamiliar vehicles appearing regularly. Neighbors' security cameras also failed to capture any suspicious activity around the Krug house. While the investigation was at a standstill, the situation with Crystal continued to worsen. Messages from Anthony Holland became increasingly aggressive and specifically threatening. One particular message in November sent the entire Krug family into a state of panic. "I will get rid of him and then we can be together. So easy." This message not only threatened Crystal, but also clearly implied harm to Dan. Both spouses felt as if their lives were being threatened directly and specifically. Dan appeared extremely worried and angry, continuously calling Detective Martinez to request increased protection for the family. Martinez felt increasing pressure from the Krug family and from his superiors at the police department. He understood that the situation was escalating and could lead to serious consequences if not controlled in time. However, with the limited information currently available, he still could not pinpoint Anthony Holland's exact location or have enough evidence to proceed with an arrest. Crystal, meanwhile, had turned documenting the threats into a full-time job. Her stalker log had now become a thick document with hundreds of entries, each entry including precise timestamps, screenshots of messages, and detailed notes about context and content. She had developed a color coding system to classify the threat level of each message. The tension in the Krug family began to show more clearly. Crystal became suspicious of every sound in the house, regularly staying up late to check security cameras and ensure that all doors and windows were securely locked. She also began carrying the gun her father had given her, even when just going to nearby places. Dan appeared very supportive of the security measures his wife implemented. He helped her check and update the stalker log, regularly reviewed new messages, and offered analyses about possible meanings behind them. However, there were some details that made Crystal feel slightly uncomfortable, although she couldn't clearly define why. Dan seemed to always know about new threatening message content even before Crystal read them. He often asked her about new messages from yesterday while she hadn't had time to check her phone in the morning. When Crystal mentioned this, Dan explained that he had developed a habit of staying up late to monitor the situation and had checked her phone to update the stalker log earlier. Additionally, Dan also displayed suspicious knowledge about the technical details of stalking and surveillance. He made very specific predictions about how Anthony might be tracking their movements, about tools and methods that a stalker might use. When Crystal asked how he knew this information, Dan said he had researched extensively on the internet to better understand the situation and find ways to protect the family. Another thing that puzzled Crystal was Dan's reaction to suggestions about changing phone numbers or temporarily relocating the family. Whenever she mentioned these options, Dan found reasons to discourage them. He reasoned that changing the phone number would cause them to lose track of Anthony and make the investigation more difficult. Regarding relocation, he said this would disrupt the children's lives and might not be effective if Anthony was truly determined to find them. These arguments seemed reasonable, but they also meant that Crystal had to continue enduring daily harassment without any escape route. She began to feel trapped in her own home, a place that was supposed to be a safe haven but had now become the target of an invisible stalker. Detective Martinez, while waiting for responses from tech companies, decided to take a different approach. He organized an undercover surveillance operation around the Krug house to see if they could catch Anthony in the act of stalking or surveilling the family. Plainclothes officers were deployed at various positions in the neighborhood, equipped with cameras and communication equipment. This operation lasted for a week at the end of November, but did not yield significant results. There were no signs of suspicious individuals or vehicles in the area. There was no evidence of physical surveillance or attempted break-ins. This made Martinez feel even more confused and frustrated about this case. While the undercover operation was ongoing, Crystal continued to receive more threatening messages from Anthony. One particularly disturbing message came on November 9th. "Saw you at dentist." This message was sent just a few hours after Crystal had gone to the dentist for a regular checkup. The timing was too accurate to be a coincidence. Crystal immediately contacted Detective Martinez about this incident. Martinez realized that if Anthony was truly conducting physical surveillance of Crystal, then his undercover operation should have detected his presence. The fact that they saw no one suspicious made Martinez begin to wonder if there was another possibility for how Anthony obtained this information. A few days later, the first response from tech companies began to trickle in. Google provided preliminary information about some IP addresses associated with the email account Holland that had been used to send threatening messages. Martinez was excited to analyze this data, hoping it would provide the breakthrough he had been waiting for. However, when examining the IP logs carefully, Martinez discovered a very interesting and troubling detail. Some emails had been sent from an IP address belonging to the network of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, where Dan Krug worked. Initially, Martinez thought this might be a coincidence or the result of IP spoofing or other technical manipulation. Martinez decided not to immediately confront Dan about this finding, instead choosing to continue the investigation discreetly. He requested additional information from Google about the exact timing of the emails and specific computers or devices used to access the email account. He also began looking into the possibility of insider access at Dan's workplace. While the tech investigation was developing, the situation at the Krug family home continued to deteriorate. Crystal and Dan began sleeping in separate bedrooms, with Dan claiming that he wanted to be able to respond quickly if there was a security breach during the night. However, this physical separation also reflected the emotional distance growing between them. Crystal confided in her father Lars about the increasing strain in her marriage. She mentioned that Dan seemed to know too much about the stalking situation and sometimes acted strangely about suggestions to improve security or change routine. Lars, with the wisdom of age and experience, advised his daughter to trust her instincts and be careful about sharing too much information, even with her husband, until the situation was resolved. Meanwhile, Anthony Holland continued sending messages with increasing frequency and aggression. Messages began to include references to Crystal's children, mentioning their school schedule and activities. This crossed the final line for Crystal, who was determined to protect her children at all costs. Crystal made the decision to tell her oldest daughter about the situation, enough to make her aware and careful, but not enough to cause excessive fear. She also arranged with school authorities to implement additional security measures during pickup and drop-off times. School personnel were instructed not to release children to anyone outside designated family members, and to immediately notify police if there were suspicious individuals lingering around school premises. Pressure from this situation began to affect Crystal professionally. She found it difficult to concentrate at work, constantly checking her phone for new messages and worrying about her family's safety. Colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior and performance, but Crystal was reluctant to discuss her personal situation with anyone outside her immediate family circle. Dan, meanwhile, continued presenting himself as a devoted husband, battling alongside his wife against an external threat. He regularly checked in with Detective Martinez about the progress of the investigation and often expressed frustration about the slow pace of the official response. He also suggested various additional security measures and sometimes brought up ideas about how Anthony might be obtaining information about family activities. However, Detective Martinez began noticing patterns in Dan's behavior that raised some red flags. Dan seemed unusually knowledgeable about technical aspects of stalking and surveillance, offering detailed explanations about possible methods and tools. He also seemed to anticipate certain developments in the case before they actually occurred, almost as if he had advanced knowledge about what might happen next. As December approached, Martinez finally received comprehensive responses from multiple tech companies. The data revealed a complex web of fake accounts, burner phone numbers, and sophisticated digital manipulation. However, instead of pointing clearly toward Anthony Holland in Utah, evidence began suggesting something much closer to home and far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation that started as a straightforward stalking case was now poised to unveil shocking truths about deception, manipulation, and betrayal that would shake the Broomfield community to its core and forever change the lives of everyone involved. December 14th, 2023, began like any other ordinary morning at the Krug family home on Promontory Loop. The Colorado sky was crystal clear with drifting white clouds, giving no indication of the tragedy that would unfold just hours later. Crystal Krug woke up at 6:30 a.m. as usual, feeling tired after a restless night's sleep due to anxiety about the constant threatening messages from Anthony Holland. She went downstairs to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast for the family, making coffee and checking the day's schedule. Her 3 children had grown accustomed to seeing their mother always carrying her phone and occasionally checking around vigilantly. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they sensed the tension in the household. Dan Krug also woke up early as usual, but there was something different about his demeanor today. He seemed more nervous than normal, frequently checking the clock and his phone. When Crystal asked if he was okay, Dan explained that he was worried about an important meeting at work and wanted to arrive early to prepare. Breakfast proceeded in relative silence, with typical conversations about the children's study plans and work schedules. Crystal reminded Dan that she would be taking the 2 younger children to school this morning as usual, while their oldest would take the bus. Dan nodded and said he would leave the house first to avoid traffic. However, instead of leaving early as usual, Dan stayed 30 minutes longer than his normal schedule. He explained to Crystal that he wanted to ensure the family's safety before going to work, especially given the increasingly serious threatening messages. Crystal felt touched by her husband's concern, not knowing that this was part of a carefully calculated plan. As Crystal prepared to take the children to school, Dan performed several strange actions that she didn't notice in the morning rush. He took a roll of blue painter's tape from the kitchen drawer, the type typically used for painting walls, and carefully hid it in his jacket pocket. He also turned off the dash cam in his car, a device he always kept on under the pretense of protecting the family from stalkers. At 7:45 a.m., Crystal kissed her husband goodbye and left the house with the 2 younger children. She drove them to school, just as she had done countless times before, not knowing this would be the last time she would perform this routine. Throughout the drive, she remained anxious and occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror to see if anyone was following. After dropping the children at school, Crystal drove home with a heavy and tired mood. She thought about her conversation with Detective Martinez the day before, when he reported that there had been no significant progress in locating Anthony Holland. She also considered her father's suggestion about possibly moving in with him temporarily until the situation was resolved. When Crystal drove into her garage around 8 a.m., she had no idea that Dan had returned by 7:15 a.m. at the latest and was hiding in the shadows of the garage. He had used the remote control to open the garage door from inside, creating the illusion that he had left for work as normal. Before Crystal returned home, Dan had made careful preparations. He used the blue tape to cover the doorbell camera at the front entrance, ensuring that no footage would record his continued presence at home. He had also prepared a blunt object, possibly a hammer or metal bar, and hidden it in the garage. When Crystal drove into the garage and turned off the engine, she stepped out of the car as usual, carrying her purse and checking her phone for any new messages. In that moment of complete vulnerability, Dan emerged from behind with the blunt object in his hand. The attack was swift and brutal. Dan struck Crystal's head multiple times in succession, causing her to fall to the garage floor and lose consciousness immediately. Blood flowed from multiple fractures on her skull, forming a pool on the concrete floor. When Crystal was completely unconscious, Dan moved her to a specific position and delivered the final fatal stab to her heart with a knife. After ensuring that Crystal was dead, Dan immediately began implementing the next phase of his plan to cover up the crime. He took his wife's phone and used her fingerprint to unlock the device. At 8:15 a.m., he accessed the home security system and disabled all cameras and sensors, creating a gap in the surveillance record. Dan had pre-programmed several messages from Crystal's phone to be sent automatically at specific times during the day. One message was scheduled to be sent to Crystal's brother, with vague content about her feeling confused about her marriage and having inappropriate thoughts. Another message was scheduled for Detective Martinez, implying that she had discovered something disturbing about the case. Most importantly, Dan scheduled a message from Crystal's phone to himself at 8:56 a.m., a time when he would already be at his workplace. This message would serve as part of his alibi, suggesting that Crystal was still alive and communicating normally at that time. After completing the manipulation of phone records, Dan carefully cleaned up traces of himself in the garage. He changed clothes and ensured there were no bloodstains on his person. He also positioned Crystal's body in a specific way to create the impression of a burglary gone wrong or random attack. At 8:30 a.m., Dan left the house and drove to his usual coffee shop on the way to work. This was a crucial part of his alibi plan. He deliberately created a memorable situation at the coffee shop by complaining about being served iced coffee instead of hot coffee, as he had ordered. He waited for the staff to remake it and engaged in conversation with other customers, establishing a clear timeline of his presence at this location. The barista and several customers would later remember Dan as a regular customer who had a slight complaint about his order on this particular morning. This created multiple witnesses who could confirm that Dan was at the coffee shop around the time the murder occurred. After the coffee shop, Dan drove to his workplace as normal and checked in with colleagues. He behaved normally and engaged in routine work activities. At 8:56 a.m., his phone buzzed with the message he had pre-scheduled from Crystal's phone. He showed appropriate surprise and concern when reading the message, even mentioning to a few colleagues that his wife seemed upset about something. Throughout the morning, Dan maintained the facade of a husband worried about his wife, but focused on work responsibilities. He periodically tried calling Crystal's phone, creating call logs that would support his story about trying to reach her throughout the day. Around 11 a.m., Dan began expressing increasing concern about being unable to contact Crystal. He called the home phone multiple times and sent additional text messages. He also mentioned the situation to his supervisor, explaining that with the ongoing stalking situation, he was very worried when his wife didn't respond to communications. At 12:13 p.m., Dan made a call to the Broomfield Police Department's non-emergency line. His voice in this call sounded genuinely worried and confused. He explained that his wife had not responded to text messages or phone calls since morning, and with the threatening situation involving a stalker, he was very concerned for her safety. "I don't think this is an emergency, but this feels really weird," Dan told the dispatcher. "My wife isn't responding to text messages or phone calls, and we've been dealing with a stalker situation. I'm really worried something might have happened to her." The dispatcher assured Dan that an officer would be dispatched to perform a welfare check at his home address. Dan provided the address and additional context about the stalking situation, emphasizing that the family had been receiving threats and Crystal might be in danger. Officer John O'Hare was assigned the welfare check call and arrived at the Krug residence at approximately 12:28 p.m. He parked his patrol car on the street and approached the front door of the house. He knocked loudly and called out, but received no response. He peered through windows and saw that everything appeared orderly inside. O'Hare then decided to check the garage area, thinking Crystal might be in the yard or garage and not hear the door knocking. However, the garage windows were too high for him to see inside from ground level. He went back to his patrol car and drove into the driveway, positioning the push bumper of his vehicle close enough to the garage window to use as a step. When O'Hare stepped up onto the push bumper and looked through the garage window, the sight he saw immediately shocked him to his core. Crystal was lying motionless on the concrete floor in a pool of blood, with obvious head injuries and what appeared to be a stab wound to the chest area. O'Hare immediately radioed for medical backup and additional units, declaring the scene a potential homicide. He attempted to enter the garage to check for signs of life, but quickly realized that Crystal had been dead for several hours. Scene preservation became the immediate priority as O'Hare established a perimeter and waited for detective units to arrive. Meanwhile, at his workplace, Dan received a call from the Broomfield Police Department informing him about the situation at his home. The officer on the phone did not provide specific details, only saying that there had been an incident and Dan needed to return home immediately. Dan expressed appropriate shock and concern, told his colleagues about the emergency call, and immediately left work to drive home. During the 15-minute drive from his workplace to home, Dan used this time to mentally prepare for the performance he would need to deliver when he arrived at the scene. He practiced expressions of grief and shock, thinking about how a devoted husband would react upon learning of his wife's tragic death. When Dan arrived at the house, he saw multiple police cars and an ambulance in the driveway. The neighborhood had begun gathering behind police tape, wondering what had happened in their normally quiet residential area. Dan parked his car down the street and ran toward the house, shouting about needing to get to his wife. Officers initially prevented Dan from entering the crime scene, but victim advocate Heather Aites was called to assist with the family member. Dan's performance of grief and shock appeared genuine to all observers. He broke down crying, repeatedly asked what had happened, and mentioned the stalker threats the family had been receiving. "The stalker did this," Dan sobbed to officers. "I told you guys this was serious. We've been getting threats for months. He said he was going to hurt her." Aites comforted Dan and helped him understand preliminary information about what had happened. She noted in her report that Dan appeared genuinely devastated and kept asking about the children and how he was going to tell them about their mother's death. Detective Martinez arrived at the scene shortly after Dan and began the preliminary investigation. The initial assessment suggested a home invasion or attack by the stalker the family had been reporting. The garage door had been open, suggesting a possible entry point, and the positioning of the body was consistent with a surprise attack. However, Martinez also noted several details that seemed slightly off. The camera system had been disabled around the time of the attack, which could indicate either a sophisticated stalker or inside knowledge of the system. Also, despite the ongoing threats, there were no signs of forced entry into the house itself. Martinez decided to immediately intensify the search for Anthony Holland, treating him as the prime suspect in the murder. A warrant was issued for Holland's arrest, and an all-points bulletin was sent out to law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Meanwhile, the investigation team began processing the crime scene with forensic equipment and photography. Blood spatter analysis, fingerprint collection, and examination of any potential weapons became immediate priorities. However, no obvious murder weapon was found at the scene, suggesting the killer had removed it. Dan was taken to the police station for a formal interview as a witness and family member. Throughout the interview, he maintained a consistent story about the stalking threats and expressed genuine-seeming grief about his wife's death. He provided detailed information about Anthony Holland and the timeline of threatening messages, appearing helpful and cooperative with the investigation. However, some subtle inconsistencies in Dan's statements began to emerge during the lengthy interview process. Details about the timing of certain events didn't quite match up, and he seemed unusually knowledgeable about technical aspects of stalking behavior. Martinez made mental notes of these discrepancies, but initially attributed them to stress and trauma from the situation. As the day progressed, news of the murder spread throughout the Broomfield community. Neighbors expressed shock and fear, wondering if a dangerous stalker was still in the area and potentially targeting other families. The school district implemented additional security measures, and many residents began checking their own home security systems. The investigation into Anthony Holland's location intensified, with law enforcement agencies in Utah and Idaho receiving urgent requests for assistance. Meanwhile, technology companies finally began providing detailed digital forensics data about email accounts and phone records associated with the stalking campaign. However, instead of pointing clearly toward Holland, initial digital evidence began revealing surprising patterns that suggested something far more complex and sinister than a straightforward stalker murder case. The investigation that had begun as a tragedy caused by an external threat was about to uncover shocking truths about betrayal and deception from within the victim's own home. On December 14th, 2023, just hours after Crystal Krug's body was discovered, the entire Broomfield police force shifted to high alert status. Detective Martinez coordinated the manhunt for Anthony Holland with the urgency of a hot homicide case. An arrest warrant for Holland on stalking charges was issued immediately and upgraded to a fugitive warrant for first-degree murder. The manhunt began with urgent contact to police departments in Utah and Idaho. Martinez called directly to the police chief of Eagle Mountain County in Utah, where the private investigator had identified Holland's last known address. Information about Holland was sent along with images from his old driver's license and detailed descriptions of the suspect. While the manhunt was underway, the Broomfield community was plunged into fear and panic. News of the murder spread rapidly through local media channels and social media. Neighbors in the Anthem Highlands area locked their doors tight and called each other to share information about the killer on the loose. Schools in the area increased security measures, with police deployed to patrol around schools and ensure student safety. Many parents decided to pick up their children early, not daring to let them take the bus as usual. A tense atmosphere enveloped the entire small town. Late in the afternoon of December 14th, Utah police reported that they had located Anthony Holland. He was at his home in Eagle Mountain, a small town more than 8 hours' drive from Broomfield. Utah police tactical teams prepared to execute the arrest warrant the following morning. However, when Utah officers arrived at Holland's home on the morning of December 15th, they encountered a completely unexpected situation. Holland opened the door with a confused and shocked expression upon seeing police. When asked about Crystal Krug, Holland showed genuine surprise and said he only vaguely remembered that name from his college years more than 20 years ago. "I don't understand what's happening," Holland told the officers. "Crystal Krug? That name sounds familiar, but I don't remember clearly. We knew each other a long time ago." Investigation of Holland's alibi proceeded quickly and thoroughly. Within hours, Utah police determined that Holland had a perfect alibi for the time of the murder. He had shopped at a local grocery store on the morning of December 14th, with receipts and security camera footage recording his presence. Furthermore, record checks showed Holland had no airplane tickets in recent times, no car rentals, and his personal vehicle showed no signs of long-distance travel. The mileage on his car odometer was consistent with only local area travel. Investigation of Holland's neighbors and workplace also confirmed that he had been present in Utah for many days before and after the crime. When information about Holland's alibi was relayed back to Broomfield, Detective Martinez felt shocked and confused. If Holland wasn't Crystal's killer, then who had done it? And more importantly, who had conducted the months-long harassment campaign using Holland's identity? Martinez decided to expand the investigation in a completely new direction. Instead of focusing on finding an external stalker, he began considering the possibility that someone close to Crystal had created the entire fake stalking scenario. The key question was, who had enough detailed information about Crystal's daily life to be able to conduct such surveillance? The FBI's digital investigation team was brought in to analyze the threatening emails and messages more deeply. Lead technician Sarah Chen spent hours analyzing metadata from each email from the A. Holland account and tracing their IP addresses. This meticulous work began revealing unusual patterns. The first and most important discovery came from IP address analysis. Chen discovered that a significant number of threatening emails had been sent from an IP address belonging to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment Network, exactly where Dan Krug worked. The timing of these emails coincided with Dan's work hours at the office. "This cannot be a coincidence," Chen reported to Martinez. "This IP address is password protected, and only department employees can access it. Furthermore, the email sending times match exactly with Dan Krug's work schedule." Martinez felt enlightened. Suddenly, all the strange details in Dan's behavior began to make sense. His knowing too much about technical aspects of stalking, his seeming to anticipate the content of threatening messages, and his discouraging Crystal from changing her phone number, all were pointing toward a frightening conclusion. The investigation was expanded to include tracing the burner phones that had been used to send threatening messages. The digital forensics team discovered that these phones had been purchased from various stores in the Denver area, always paid for in cash. However, an important breakthrough occurred when they traced the source of money used to buy these phones. Investigation showed that the burner phones had been purchased with Visa gift cards, and these gift cards had been purchased and registered with Dan Krug's personal information. Although Dan tried to conceal the gift card purchases by using different stores and timing, the digital trail still led back to him. Analysis of location data from the burner phones revealed an even more suspicious pattern. These phones consistently moved together with Dan's personal phone, appearing at his workplace, at home, and at various locations he visited. This correlation was too perfect to be coincidence. Martinez decided to proceed with search warrants for Dan's home and workplace, but he was careful not to inform Dan about these suspicions. Instead, he explained the search as part of routine investigation to look for additional evidence about an external stalker. While the search was being planned, another breakthrough occurred from analyzing search history on Dan's work computer. The IT department of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment provided logs showing a pattern of suspicious searches from the computer assigned to Dan. Just 17 hours before Crystal was killed, Dan had searched "how hard to hit someone to cause unconsciousness" on Google from his work computer. He also searched "head trauma recovery time, how to disable home security systems remotely, and best ways to delete phone message history." These searches formed a clear timeline of planning for murder. When Martinez reviewed the timeline of events on December 14th, he noticed many inconsistencies in Dan's story. Although Dan claimed he was worried about his wife and had tried to contact her throughout the morning, phone records showed he only made calls after 11 a.m., after Crystal had been dead for several hours. Furthermore, analysis of the pre-programmed messages from Crystal's phone revealed a level of sophistication that required intimate knowledge of her daily routine and communication patterns. The messages were carefully crafted to sound like authentic communications from Crystal, but digital timestamps showed they had been scheduled the night before the murder. One particularly incriminating detail was the message Dan received from Crystal's phone at 8:56 a.m., right when he had established his alibi at the workplace. Digital analysis showed this message had been scheduled for automatic sending at 7:15 p.m. the evening before, when Dan still had physical access to Crystal's phone. With overwhelming evidence pointing toward Dan, Martinez coordinated with the district attorney's office to prepare an arrest warrant. However, they decided to continue surveillance of Dan for a few days to gather additional evidence and ensure the strongest possible case. During these days, Dan continued behaving like a grieving widower, meeting with funeral directors, comforting the children, and cooperating with the ongoing investigation. He even suggested additional avenues for police to explore in searching for Anthony Holland, appearing helpful and like a concerned citizen. However, the surveillance team noticed subtle behaviors that raised additional red flags. Dan seemed unusually interested in the progress of the investigation, frequently calling Martinez to ask about updates. He also spent considerable time organizing Crystal's personal belongings, potentially looking for anything that might incriminate him. Interviews with Crystal's family members revealed additional troubling information. Crystal's mother mentioned that her daughter had spoken about problems in her marriage and had considered divorce. Crystal's brother confirmed that she had expressed concerns about Dan's controlling behavior and had been planning to take the children and move out of the house. These revelations provided a potential motive for murder. Dan was facing the loss of his wife, children, and potentially significant financial consequences from divorce proceedings. Creating the stalking scenario could have been an attempt to drive Crystal closer to him, positioning himself as a protective husband against an external threat. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when investigators discovered a previous pattern of similar behavior from Dan's past. Interview with a former girlfriend from 20 years earlier revealed that Dan had engaged in a nearly identical stalking campaign, creating fake online personas to harass her after their breakup. Although no charges were filed at that time, the pattern of behavior was identical to what happened with Crystal. Armed with comprehensive evidence, an arrest warrant was issued for Daniel Krug on December 16, 2023. He was arrested at his workplace, still maintaining the facade of an innocent husband grieving the loss of his wife. When handcuffs were placed on his wrists, Dan finally dropped the pretense and revealed a glimpse of his real personality underneath. He demanded a lawyer and refused to make any statements, a dramatic contrast to the helpful cooperation he had shown throughout the investigation. News of Dan's arrest shocked the Broomfield community, with many people initially refusing to believe that a devoted husband could be capable of such elaborate deception and brutal murder. Media coverage exploded as the story of the fake stalking campaign and calculated murder captured national attention. The investigation that began as a straightforward stalking case had evolved into a complex study of domestic manipulation, psychological control, and ultimate betrayal. The truth about Anthony Holland's innocence, Dan Krug's guilt, and the sophisticated nature of the deception scheme revealed the dark reality of how domestic violence can hide behind carefully constructed facades. With Dan in custody and overwhelming evidence compiled, the next phase of the case would involve legal proceedings that would expose the full extent of his calculated cruelty and attempt to frame an innocent man for murder he committed. Justice for Crystal Krug was finally within reach, but the scars from this betrayal would have a lasting impact on the family and community for years to come. March 2024 marked the beginning of trial preparation for one of the most shocking murder cases in Broomfield, Colorado history. The 17th Judicial District Attorney's Office was tasked with building a solid case against Daniel Krug, who had transformed from a seemingly grieving husband into the prime suspect in taking his wife's life. Chief Deputy District Attorney Stephanie Fritz and Senior Deputy District Attorney Kate Armstrong were appointed to lead the prosecution team. These veteran attorneys had years of experience handling complex domestic violence cases, but they acknowledged that the Daniel Krug case presented special challenges due to the sophisticated nature of the cover-up plan and the absence of direct physical evidence. What shocked me most about this case wasn't the brutality of the act, but the absolute arrogance that Daniel Krug displayed, Armstrong shared in a later interview. He truly believed he could manipulate not only his family and loved ones, but the entire law enforcement system. The biggest challenge facing the prosecution team was building a case based primarily on digital and circumstantial evidence. No one directly witnessed the attack. There were no fingerprints from Daniel on the murder weapon because it was never found, and not a single drop of Crystal's blood was discovered on Daniel's clothing or in his car. However, the digital evidence was extremely rich and detailed. The investigation team had created a complex timeline spanning hundreds of pages, tracking every email, message, and internet activity of Daniel's for months before the murder. They were able to prove that Daniel had created at least 5 different fake email accounts, purchased and used 7 burner phones, and carried out over 300 separate acts of harassment while posing as Anthony Holland. The defense team, led by attorney Philip Geigel, chose a strategy focused on criticizing the police investigation process and emphasizing the absence of physical evidence. Geigel argued that the initial investigation's focus on Anthony Holland had contaminated the crime scene and led to missing important evidence that could point to the real perpetrator. Members of the jury, Geigel said in his opening statement, will see that there is an enormous disconnect between the physical evidence and the circumstantial picture that the prosecution wants you to believe. Daniel Krug did not take his wife's life. He did not commit these crimes. The formal trial began in April 2025 at the Broomfield County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with observers, including family members from both sides, reporters from across the country, and Broomfield residents wanting to witness justice for one of the most shocking crimes in their community's history. Judge Priscilla Lowe, A respected female judge with more than 20 years of experience handling serious criminal cases presided over the trial. She established strict rules about media coverage and ensured the trial proceeded fairly despite widespread media attention. The first week of the trial focused on presenting the background and timeline of the case. The prosecutors methodically reconstructed the story of the crumbling marriage between Daniel and Crystal, starting from the first signs of Crystal wanting a divorce and seeking independent custody. Linda Grimsrud, Crystal's mother, was one of the first and most powerful witnesses for the prosecution. She told the jury about her final conversations with her daughter, in which Crystal had expressed concerns about Daniel's increasingly controlling behavior and desire to end the marriage. "My daughter told me that she felt like she was being watched in her own home," Mrs. Grimsrud testified with a trembling voice. She didn't know that the watcher was the man she had trusted most in this world. Lars Grimsrud, Crystal's father, provided heartbreaking testimony about his daughter's final days. He described Crystal coming to his garage with a fearful expression to tell him about being stalked and his decision to give her a gun for self-defense. "I thought I was protecting my daughter from a stranger," Lars said, tears streaming down his face. "I never could have imagined that the danger was coming from the man she had loved and married." Detective Andrew Martinez presented detailed testimony about the investigation, acknowledging the initial mistakes in focusing on Anthony Holland, but explaining how digital evidence ultimately led to the truth. Martinez also expressed deep regret about not acting faster based on early warning signs. "This case has haunted me since it occurred," Martinez testified. "The outcome of this case has haunted me for the past 2 years. If I could get in a time machine, I would definitely make that call." The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the presentation of digital evidence. Forensic technician Sarah Chen spent 3 days explaining to the jury how metadata, IP addresses, and digital timestamps had created an undeniable web of evidence, pointing to Daniel as the mastermind behind the fake stalking campaign. Chen used complex charts and timelines to demonstrate how the burner phone's activity correlated perfectly with Daniel's daily schedule. She pointed out that the probability of this correlation occurring by chance was essentially impossible. "This data doesn't lie," Chen concluded her testimony. "These patterns could only be created by someone who had access to all these devices and intimate knowledge of the victim's daily life." One of the most powerful moments of the trial occurred when the prosecution played a recording of Crystal talking with Detective Martinez about her stalker log. Crystal's voice, full of fear but determined, resonated throughout the silent courtroom as she described her fear and frustration about the situation. "This is escalating," Crystal's voice from the recording said. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm scared for my family." Anthony Holland was brought from Utah to testify, providing powerful testimony about his shock and confusion upon learning that his identity had been used in an elaborate deception scheme. Holland described the minimal relationship he had once had with Crystal over 20 years ago and complete lack of contact since then. "I don't understand why someone would choose me for this," Holland testified. "Crystal was a wonderful person from what I remember, but we were only friends for a short time. I had no reason to harm her or her family." Daniel's defense focused on creating doubt about the timeline and methodology of the investigation. Giegel called expert witnesses to challenge the reliability of digital evidence and suggested that a sophisticated hacker might have manipulated records to frame Daniel. However, the defense case encountered significant challenges when their witnesses couldn't provide plausible alternative explanations for the overwhelming digital evidence. Cross-examination from the prosecution team exposed weaknesses in defense theories and highlighted the impossibility of the scenarios the defense was proposing. Daniel did not testify in his own defense, a decision the defense team had debated extensively. Giegel later explained that Daniel's personality and history of deception made putting him on the witness stand too risky. Closing arguments took place at the end of April, with both sides presenting passionate summations of their cases. Armstrong delivered a powerful closing for the prosecution, systematically walking through the evidence and painting a picture of Daniel as a calculating manipulator who had betrayed the ultimate trust. Daniel Krug did not love his wife, Armstrong told the jury. He hated her. Think about what he did to her. He terrorized her for months, made her afraid in her own home, and then he brutally took her life when his plan began to unravel. Geigel, in his closing defense, made a final attempt to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the circumstantial nature of the evidence was not sufficient for conviction in a death penalty case. He emphasized Daniel's alibi at the coffee shop and the lack of physical evidence linking him to the actual murder. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Geigel concluded, "there is an enormous disconnect between the physical evidence and the circumstantial picture that the prosecution wants you to believe. Daniel Krug did not kill his wife." The jury deliberated for only 1 day before returning with a verdict. Tension in the courtroom was palpable as the court clerk read the findings. Guilty on all charges, first-degree murder, 2 counts of stalking, and criminal impersonation. When the verdict was announced, emotional reactions from both families created a dramatic scene in the courtroom. Crystal's family embraced each other and wept tears of both relief and continued grief, while Daniel's parents sat in shocked silence, refusing to accept that their son was capable of such crimes. The sentencing hearing took place the next day, with Judge Lowe imposing the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the murder conviction. She also added an additional 9.5 years for the stalking and impersonation charges, all consecutive. The depths of depravity, the manipulation that the defendant displayed in torturing Crystal and her children, knew no bounds, Judge Lowe said when announcing the sentence. The terror that he inflicted on her and her children is unimaginable. Lars Grimsrud delivered a heartbreaking victim impact statement, describing the devastating impact of his daughter's death on the entire family and especially on the 3 grandchildren who were now orphaned. "Our entire family will never be the same again," he told the court. "These 3 children have lost not only their mother but also their father, and they will have to grow up with the knowledge that the person who was supposed to protect them was responsible for the greatest tragedy in their lives." Surprisingly, Jeremy Krug, Daniel's older brother, also addressed the court, providing painful insight into the impact of the case on the defendant's family. Jeremy admitted that the family had held out hope that someone else was responsible for the tragedy, but the evidence presented at trial was too overwhelming to ignore. "Support is dwindling," Jeremy said, looking directly at his brother. "Mom and Dad want to believe you very much. I want to believe you very much. But there's a lot that's come out, and as imaginative as I can be with finding explanations, some of it is beyond even my creativity." Daniel chose not to speak before being sentenced, maintaining the silence that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. His attorney later released a statement claiming that Daniel maintained his innocence and would fight the wrongful conviction on appeal. Immediately after the conviction, in a video call from jail with his family, Daniel continued claiming that the jury got it wrong and the real killer was still at large. He even suggested that his children might become the next targets, urging his family to move the children out of Colorado. "I need them safe," Daniel said in the recorded call. "I don't know where or who did this, where he is or who he is. I need my children out of Colorado." These recordings were later used by the prosecution to demonstrate continued manipulation and lack of remorse from Daniel, even after conviction. Psychological experts noted that this behavior was typical of narcissistic individuals who are unable to accept responsibility for their actions. Crystal Krug's case created a lasting impact beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Rebecca Ivanoff, Crystal's cousin and former prosecutor specializing in domestic violence, began an advocacy campaign for faster response from tech companies to stalking-related search warrants. "Crystal did everything right," Ivanoff argued. "The system operated as currently designed, and she still got killed. We have a system failure that needs to be addressed." Emily Tofta-Nesteval, executive director of a Colorado-based legal service nonprofit that assisted Crystal's family, supported Ivanov's 48-hour response window proposal, calling it more than reasonable. Her organization had encountered many cases where a more timely and diligent response from communication providers could have been life-saving. District Attorney Brian Mason noted the critical importance of quick response from tech companies, emphasizing that criminals can turn from stalking a victim to killing that victim at any time. He pointed out that many stalkers leave a digital trail of evidence that can be used to identify suspects and save lives. Crystal Krug's legacy continues through changes in the legal system and increased awareness about the sophisticated nature of modern domestic violence. Her children, now being raised by their uncle and aunt with support from extended family, carry forward the memory of a mother who had been described as brilliant, warm, and resilient. Lars Grimsrud continues honoring his daughter's memory by passing down their shared hobby of car restoration to his grandchildren. In the garage with these children, they run that electric screwdriver, and they can tear a carburetor apart. That's the whole idea. She would get such a kick out of seeing the kids doing the stuff that she was involved in. Daniel Krug is currently serving his sentence at the Colorado Department of Corrections. As a prisoner sentenced to life without parole, he will remain incarcerated for the rest of his life unless his conviction is overturned. He continues to contest the verdict and maintain his innocence in the appeals process. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about sophisticated manipulation tactics in the digital age and the importance of believing victims, even when threats appear to come from external sources. Crystal's story reminds us that domestic violence can hide behind carefully constructed facades, and that technology can be weaponized to create elaborate deceptions. Justice for Crystal Krug has been achieved through the legal system, but the scars from betrayal and loss will affect the family and community for generations. Her memory as a devoted mother, brilliant engineer, and brave woman who stood up against what she perceived as an external threat will endure as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable evil.